She wasn't a pilot, just some middle-aged woman in boots too old and a jacket too plain. That's what the young tech muttered as she stood quietly at the edge of Hangar 3, watching the Apache shimmer beneath the desert heat. Probably used to run coffee, not cockpits, he joked to the others, loud enough for her to hear. She didn't flinch. Didn't speak. Just placed her worn leather duffel next to the bench and glanced toward the rusted flight logbook resting atop her case, a book stamped with dates no one there had bothered to read, names they wouldn't recognize, coordinates long scrubbed from public memory. That night, long after the hangar lights had gone out and the whispers had quieted, a lieutenant happened upon her simulator file, a routine test slot logged under the name C. Daniels, and saw something he couldn't explain. Maneuvers no one on base had clearance to perform, patterns exclusive to classified blackout runs last seen in Kandahar. He forwarded it. The next morning, the colonel arrived in person, not for a reprimand, but to salute the woman they refused to let fly. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe experience still outranks ego, like and subscribe, because this story proves the sky remembers who earned it. Celia Daniels stepped onto the base at 0500 wearing no rank, no ribbons, just a faded 160th sore patch, and the kind of posture that made men pause without knowing why. 47 years old, with short silver-shot hair pulled tight beneath a ball cap and boots polished more from habit than for show, she'd been cleared as a civilian systems analyst for a weapons integration demo, nothing more. The front office handed her a clipboard and a waiver, then sent her down to the simulator with no fanfare. She passed the younger pilots in the break room, none of whom looked up. One leaned to another and smirked. She doesn't look like she's ever even flown. They called her ma'am, like it was a warning label. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. Because behind her silent set of 1,000 flight hours no one had read 2 silver stars, 1 distinguished flying cross, 3 emergency landings in enemy territory, and a file that had once been redacted so heavily even her commanding officer didn't know what she'd done. They didn't ask. So she didn't tell. Instead, she walked the hangar perimeter, eyes scanning the Apache's wiring nodes like she was mapping them from memory, fingers ghosting over the tail rotor like a mechanic, not a pilot. By noon, the tech team had fully dismissed her. Someone laughed when she asked for a sim lock-in. We usually give those to people still in uniform. She signed up anyway. Graveyard slot. 0200 hours. Unsupervised. That night, while the base slept and no one was watching, she loaded the simulator and keyed in a custom environment. No prompts, no instruction set, just raw terrain and atmospheric interference. What followed was 42 minutes of uninterrupted flight data that traced through 6 predictive combat routes, all of which matched actual battlefield patterns never released to the public. She didn't fly it like a test. She flew it like she'd been there. And the machine responded. Precision landing under blackout conditions. Altitude burst at 3-second delay to simulate rotor ghosting. A reverse blade stall maneuver not seen in training manuals since 2007. The footage wasn't flagged by the machine, but it was flagged by Riley Knox, a junior warrant officer assigned to data logs. He sat up in his bunk, stunned. She hadn't just passed the sim, she had rewritten the operating logic. He dug into the file ID. Celia Daniels, it read. No bio, no photo, just a birthday and a clearance code that triggered a classified access warning. The next morning, Riley asked his commanding officer about her. The CO waved it off. She's some test consultant. Background check cleared. Just make sure she doesn't touch the aircraft. But Riley wasn't satisfied. He ran her name through old mission logs using a side channel, and that's when it hit. Celia CJ Daniels wasn't just a test analyst. She had once flown blackout medevac during Operation Dust Veil, a mission whispered about, not written, where 3 Apaches had gone in and only 1 came out. Her call sign? Night Mother. Her signature? Extraction without air support, under fire, no casualties. And no one on this base had any idea. Until that afternoon, when a black SUV pulled onto the tarmac and outstepped Colonel Reed himself, the man who had once briefed CJ Daniels before every classified flight. He didn't shake hands. Didn't ask questions. He walked straight across the field toward the woman standing beside an idle Apache with a wrench in her hand and boots in the dirt. And without a word, the colonel stopped 3 feet from her and saluted. Not because she wore a uniform, but because she had earned the sky. And now, everyone else knew it. They said it was probably a favor, that the colonel just knew her somehow, or owed her something, because that's easier than admitting you overlooked a legend while she stood quietly 10 feet from you, calibrating equipment you never learned to handle. After the salute, the hangar fell silent. No speeches. No apologies. Just the weight of eyes shifting in real time, from contempt to confusion, from dismissal to realization. And yet, Celia didn't revel in it. She didn't smile. She didn't correct anyone. She simply handed the wrench to the startled crew chief beside her and walked back toward the sim bay as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Inside the base office, whispers turned to searches, and searches turned into questions no one had good answers for. Who the hell is she really? Why didn't anyone vet her? Why is her name coming up in Tier 1 debrief logs? Raleigh Knox, the only one who'd bothered to look past her boots and into her history, watched the panic ripple through the ranks with a mix of awe and guilt. Because he'd heard the jokes too, laughed once, until he found the memo buried in a 2009 redacted file from SOCOM that referred to a pilot known only as CD. She flew blackout zones, ran extraction under drone jammers, and led the last successful evasion maneuver after the Kandahar breach. And now she was at his base, sleeping in a civilian trailer with no access badge, no salute, no respect. That night, Riley did something he didn't even tell command. He logged into a restricted archive using credentials he wasn't supposed to have. What he found hit harder than he expected. A single-page scan. Field citation Operation Dustveil. Pilot, Major Celia J. Daniels. Actions, with engine loss, navigated under low-altitude radar cover to extract 6 men surrounded at 3 points. Ignored direct order to disengage. Result, 0 casualties. Immediate evac. Notes, pilot sustained rotor debris laceration and partial hearing loss. Refused medevac until final soldier was secure. Outcome, entire mission log sealed. That was the woman that called ma'am like an insult. He printed the citation. Quietly. Slid it into a manila folder. Took it to Colonel Reed. The colonel didn't ask how he got it. He just stared at the page and said, "Make sure it ends up in her personnel file. And this time, don't bury it." The next morning, Celia arrived at the tarmac same time as always. Coffee in hand. Clipboard under her arm. Not a single medal, not a single title on her jacket. But when she approached the hangar, 2 cadets stepped aside without needing to be told. When she nodded, they nodded back. Change hadn't come loudly. It came like she always had, steady, quiet, earned. Later that day, Colonel Reed called a full command meeting. No formal reason. Just a quick check-in before the new flight software demo. But when the team gathered in the operations bay, no one expected what came next. On the big screen behind him, he didn't show a briefing chart or a flight log. He showed a photograph. Grainy. Dated. A woman in full tactical gear standing beside a battered Apache with a busted nose cone and smoke still rising behind her. This was Operation Dustveil, Reed began. A mission that was never supposed to succeed. It did. Because of her. He turned to the room, where eyes had gone wide, and mouths were already parting in disbelief. You've been working beside her for a week. Some of you laughed. Some of you looked right through her. He gestured toward the screen. Major Celia Daniels. Night Mother. The reason half our extraction protocols exist. And for the record, no, she didn't ask for this introduction. In fact, she's going to hate me for doing this. Laughter tried to break the tension, but it didn't quite land. Because most of them knew they had already failed the real test, not in the air, but on the ground. Celia walked in mid-slide. She froze when she saw her photo on screen. Reed just smiled. "Ma'am," he said, this time with full meaning, "you're cleared for the flight deck." For the first time in years, she stepped into a cockpit. Not a simulator. Not a mock-up. A real Apache, loaded, functional, hers. And as the rotors wound up and the desert trembled beneath her, Celia Daniels didn't think about proving anything. She thought about the silence. The years. The file that had stayed sealed because someone thought a woman flying gunships under blackout wasn't the kind of story people wanted to remember. She was wrong. They remembered now. The first thing you noticed wasn't the sound, it was the silence. The kind of reverent quiet that settles over a base when something sacred is happening, and everyone knows better than to speak. The Apache's rotors wound up slow, deep, heavy, not like a drill, not like a test, like memory itself shaking to concrete. On the flight line, dozens of young pilots lined up in still formation, not because they were ordered, but because they had to see it. Had to see her. Celia Daniels stood beneath the blades like she'd never left, helmet in hand, eyes narrowed against the dawn. She moved like she always had, not fast, not slow, just sure. And when she climbed in, it wasn't a return. It was a reset. Inside the cockpit, she didn't fumble, didn't hesitate. Fingers flew over systems like muscle memory burned into bone. Radios, NAV, fuel checked. For a long second, the entire tarmac held its breath. Then, with the calm flick of a wrist, she lifted the bird off the ground like it belonged to her, because it did. 120 knots, 30 feet off the deck, she dropped into a low sweep around the perimeter. What started as odd turned into something else entirely when she executed a vertical climb, then a nose-down dive maneuver not seen on base since before half those pilots were born. From the control tower, command staff stood frozen. "Is that Does fail pattern Delta?" one tech whispered. "That's not even in our training modules." The colonel just nodded. It was never supposed to be. Meanwhile, back on the ground, Riley Knox held up his phone and started streaming. No narration. Just awe. Within minutes, base-wide chat lit up. "That's her. Night Mother. She's flying it like it's stitched to her spine." Celia didn't hear the bus. She didn't need to. Because up there, with the controls in her hands and the world below a blur of sunlit asphalt, she remembered who she was, not for the world, not for the record, just for herself. Her mind flashed back to blackout landings, to blood in the footwells, to voices in her comms saying, "We're not gonna make it," and her answering, "Yes, we are. Hold tight." Back then, her silence had been mistaken for fear. Now, they finally understood. It was focus, precision, leadership without ego. She circled once more, then brought the Apache down in a landing so smooth the tires didn't even squeal. As the rotors slowed, a sound rose behind her, not cheers, not orders. Applause. Reluctant at first, then rising like a storm. Cadets. Officers. Ground crew. Not one person was still seated or speaking. And at the front of it all stood Colonel Reed, arms crossed, face unreadable. When she stepped out of the bird and touched down on solid ground, boots hitting asphalt like punctuation, the colonel walked over and extended his hand. But she didn't shake it. She saluted. And he returned it, this time slower, deeper, the kind that doesn't come from rank but from reverence. "Major Daniels," he said softly, "welcome back to the sky." She nodded, her voice steady. "Didn't think I left." That afternoon, Base Command held a closed-door session. No cameras. No ceremony. Just a resolution drafted by Colonel Reed himself. Retroactive recognition, full reinstatement of flight record, addition of Daniels' does fail flight path to advanced simulator protocols. And one last entry, recommendation for instructor emeritus status. Weeks passed. She didn't mention the salute. Didn't speak of the flight. She returned to her contract post, same clipboard, same ball cap, same quiet walks along the hangar's edge. But the base had changed. They now called her man like it meant something. Young pilots leaned in when she spoke. One even jogged to catch up, asking sheepishly if she could explain how she controlled Yo during wind shifts at low altitudes. She smiled. "With your gut." He blinked. She kept walking. A month later, a new sign was quietly installed above the sim entrance. The Daniels Flight Wing. Below it, a plaque. In honor of service that needed no spotlight. And a sky that never forgets its own. Celia never commented. She didn't need to. Because every morning, just before sunrise, she sat alone beside the simulator, same posture, same silence, and waited. Not for recognition. Not for thanks. But for the next generation to arrive. One by one, they did. And they listened.